You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
He was a quiet one, the deep thinker, the soul behind the Beatles. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney grabbed all the attention, George Harrison stood in the shadows, silently building his own legacy. But underneath that calm face was something burning, a hidden anger boiling just beneath the surface. So, who was a real target of George's secret rage? Was it one of his bandmates stealing all the glory? A behind-the-scenes manager calling the shots? Or was it someone even more shocking? Today, we're peeling back the layers of one of the most surprising and complicated relationships in Beatles history. Because beneath the fame and the music was a grudge that could change how we see the Fab Four forever. And while the world focused on Lennon and McCartney's famous songwriting rivalry, another tension was quietly brewing. This time, all eyes turned to George Harrison and the one person he reportedly couldn't stand. Power struggles and creative battles were always part of the Beatles story. But George, he felt like the outsider. He wanted more say, more credit. And he wasn't getting it before it all spiraled. Let's rewind to where it began. At around 14 years old, George's music dreams started to come true. A friend named Raymond Hughes offered to sell him a guitar. His mother bought it for £3 and 10 shillings, which would be about 110 pounds today. A family friend showed him a few basic tunes like Whispering, Sweet Sue, and Dinah. And just like that, George was on his way. Inspired by Lonnie Donegan's skiffle craze, George formed a group called the Rebels with his brother Peter and a friend named Arthur Kelly. Around this time, something major happened. He met Paul McCartney. They were riding the same bus to school. That ride kicked off a friendship and musical bond that would help change music forever. In March 1958, George auditioned for John Lennon and Paul McCartney's group, the Quarrymen, at Rory Storm's Morgue Skiffle Club. At first, Lennon thought George, who had just turned 15, was too young. But McCartney wasn't ready to give up. He set up a second audition on a bus ride. This time, George played the lead guitar part raunchy, and it blew Lennon away. From there, George started hanging out with the group. Soon after, he became a full member. His father had hoped George would stay in school, but that wasn't George's path. At 16, he left school and got a job as an electrician's apprentice at Blackwell's department store. When the Quarrymen toured Scotland in 1960, George used a stage name, Carl Harrison, in honor of his idol Carl Perkins. This was just the beginning of his epic ride with the Beatles. That same year, under the guidance of manager Alan Williams, the Beatles landed gigs at the Indra and Kaiser Keller clubs in Hamburg, Germany. The bustling club scene was the perfect training ground for the young band. They sharpened their sound and their stage presence. But it didn't last long. George was still underage and got deported for working illegally in nightclubs. By December 1961, Brian Epstein stepped in as manager. He polished their image and got them a record deal with EMI. Then came their first single, Love Me Do. It hit number 17 on the charts. But that was just the start. In 1963, their debut album, Please Please Me, was released, and Beatlemania exploded around the world. George Harrison didn't shout. He didn't show off. But make no mistake, he was making waves. In the early days, he stood quietly on stage, eyes locked on a guitar, barely speaking while the crowd screamed. That quiet strength earned him a name that stuck for life, the Quiet Beatle. But what fans didn't know was just how loud George could get when it came to his music. When the Beatles arrived in America in 1964, George was sick as a dog. Fever, strep throat, barely able to talk. Doctors told him to rest his voice. So while the press snapped photos and reporters threw out questions, George stayed silent. And just like that, the nickname was born. But behind that silence was a man with vision. A man who didn't just want to play music. He wanted to transform it. As early as their second album, George was writing his own songs. Songs like Don't Bother Me. He wasn't just tagging along behind Lennon and McCartney anymore. He was building something. And then came 1965's Rubber Soul. That's where George's real revolution began. He started experimenting, first with folk rock, thanks to Bob Dylan and the Byrds. Then with something no one expected, Indian classical music on Norwegian wood. George stunned fans by playing the sitar, an instrument most Western listeners had never even heard before. It wasn't just a cool sound. It was the start of a spiritual and musical journey that would change George forever. And the world, it noticed. By the time they recorded Revolver, George wasn't just following trends. He was leading them. His song, Taxman, kicked off the album with a punch. Love You Two went full Indian, packed with sitar and tabla. He even played the tambura on Lennon's wild track, Tomorrow Never Knows. Music critics were stunned. Fans were hooked. And the press gave him a new nickname, the Maharaja of Ragarok. George wasn't just adding new sounds. He was changing the way the Beatles sounded altogether. In 1967, during the Sgt. Pepper era, George took things even further. His song, Within You Without You, wasn't just a track, it was a statement. He surrounded himself with Indian instruments, philosophy, and even featured Eastern spiritual gurus on the album's cover. But not everyone was on board. Some fans didn't understand it. Some bandmates didn't either. George later admitted that Sgt. Pepper felt like both a milestone and a burden. Still, he didn't back down. In 1968, George flew to India to record The Inner Light using local musicians. The lyrics? Inspired by Hindu texts and meditation. It was a quiet revolution, but the impact was massive. George Harrison had turned the Beatles into a bridge between East and West, between rock and raga, between pop fame and spiritual depth. But while his music soared, his relationships within the band were falling apart. By 1969, George Harrison had had enough. The Beatles were falling apart from the inside, and nowhere was that more obvious than during the Let Me filming at Twickenham Studios. Cameras were rolling, tempers were flaring, and George, he was done. On January 10th, in the middle of the session, George walked out. No dramatic speech, no long goodbye. Just a simple line scribbled in his diary. Left the Beatles. Went home. 12 days later, he came back, but only after the others agreed to ditch Paul McCartney's dream of a live concert and move their sessions to Apple Studios. Still, the damage was done. The cracks were deep, and they were growing. Even as they worked on Abbey Road, tension filled the room. But George wasn't holding back anymore. He brought in 2 tracks that would become legends. Here Comes the Sun and Something. No longer the quiet Beatle. George was finally standing toe-to-toe with Lennon and McCartney as a songwriter. Something was his first ever A-side hit, released alongside Come Together. The single exploded, hitting #1 in America and topping charts around the world. Even Frank Sinatra called it the greatest love song of the last 50 years. By 1970, George scored another chart topper with For You Blue, paired with Paul's The Long and Winding Road. But all this success came with a growing storm inside him, because no matter how many hits he wrote, he was still only allowed 2 or 3 songs per Beatles album. George was quietly amassing a vault of unreleased songs. He was writing constantly, but being shut out just as fast. And that frustration, it was eating him alive. In January 1970, George recorded with Paul and Ringo for the last time ever. They were working on final overdubs for the Let It Be soundtrack. It would be his final Beatles session. The band that once moved as one was now 4 strangers playing in the same room. But the deepest crack, the one that may never have healed, was between George and Paul. By the time the Beatles were recording Abbey Road, something had shifted, and not in a good way. George Harrison wasn't the quiet kid in the corner anymore. He was pushing back. When Paul McCartney tried to suggest changes to George's songs, George flat out rejected them. He was done taking orders, done playing second fiddle. This was George Harrison's rise, and Paul didn't see it coming. In a conversation later documented in Paul McCartney, many years from now, McCartney admitted something rare. He told John Lennon, "I think that until now, our songs have been better than George's. But this year, his songs are at least as good as ours." But George wasn't impressed. He clapped back with, "That's a myth. I wrote most of these songs last year or the year before. Maybe now I just don't care whether you like them or not. I just do am. That single moment exposed everything. George didn't want praise. He wanted respect. Behind closed doors, things were worse. In 1974, George told an interviewer, "I'd rather have Willie Weeks on bass than Paul McCartney." He wasn't mincing words. He said he respected Paul's talent, but couldn't stand working with him. "I would join a band with John Lennon any day, but I could not join a band with Paul McCartney." And it wasn't personal. At least, that's what George claimed. But in the studio, the cracks were obvious. Take Paul's song, Maxwell Silverhammer. George called it fruity. He said Paul forced him to record take after take, obsessing over every tiny detail, but only on his songs. When it was time for George's songs, Paul barely lifted a finger. Paul would help after he'd done his 10 songs. Then when it got round to one of mine, he'd finally help. It was silly. It was very selfish. To George, it was more than annoying. It was humiliating. In his eyes, Paul didn't just dominate the band, he controlled it. And every time George brought in something heartfelt or experimental, Paul picked it apart. Years later, in a 2020 interview, even Paul admitted it. It was easy to underestimate George. Me and John always wrote most of the stuff, but then George started to bloom. But by the time he said it, it was decades too late. The damage had been done. George's fight for respect wasn't just about song count. It was about being seen, being heard, being taken seriously. And Paul's perfectionism? It made George feel small. In one radio interview, George said bluntly, "Paul McCartney ruined me as a guitar player." But then he followed it with a line that shows just how complicated things were. No matter what we've been through, there's always been something that's tied us together. Even after John Lennon died, when the remaining 3 Beatles reunited in 1994, George and Paul still clashed. They disagreed over unfinished Lennon tracks. They got on each other's nerves. Nothing had changed. In public, they smiled. But behind the scenes, the scars ran deep. In one of his final public chats before his death, George was asked if Paul still annoyed him. His reply? "Scan not a friend with microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." It was a Victorian proverb, but really it was George saying, "Yeah, he drove me crazy, but I let it go." Because love and frustration often live side by side in the Beatles. And for George Harrison, Paul McCartney was both a brother and a burden. George Harrison's final goodbye wasn't what fans expected. He wasn't just a Beatle anymore. He was a man fighting for his life. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison passed away. He was just 58 years old. Cancer had taken over. First his throat, then his lungs, then his brain. He fought quietly, privately, with the same grace he brought to his music. Paul McCartney visited George just 10 days before he died. And what happened in that room? It would change everything. "We joked about things," Paul said later. "Nutty stuff. It was good. It was like we were dreaming." Then he said something shocking for a man from Liverpool. "We held hands." Even at their closest, Paul and George never did that. It wasn't what blokes did, but now it meant everything. "He was my baby brother," Paul whispered. The day after George's death, Paul repeated it for the world to hear. "A lovely guy, a brave man, my baby brother." After all the fights, the studio tension, the jealousy, the unspoken words, this was what was left. Love, respect, regret. And while Paul and George had their scars, their children, Stella McCartney and Donnie Harrison, were different. They weren't caught in the same battles. Stella, born in 1971. Donnie, born in 1978. 2 kids raised in the shadows of Beatles legends. But instead of conflict, they found family in each other. When Martin Scorsese released Living in the Material World, Stella cried when Donnie read his father's letters. She felt George's soul in every word. And in 2012, Stella gave something back. She designed the wedding dress for Donnie's wife, Solveig Caradottir. Years later, Donnie surprised Stella at a gala, performing Live and Let Die, one of Paul's most iconic songs. It was a love letter to both of their fathers. A reminder that the music and the friendship never died. Their bond is proof. No matter how messy things got between Paul and George, their children turned that pain into something beautiful. But George's personal life? That was a storm of its own. Let's talk about his marriages. In 1966, George married Pattie Boyd, a stunning model he met while filming A Hard Day's Night. Paul McCartney was the best man. The proposal? George asked her during a lunch break. It seemed perfect, but it wasn't. Behind the glamour was betrayal. George cheated again and again. And then came the final blow. George had an affair with Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife. Pattie was devastated. She called it the final straw. Their last year together was chaos, fueled by drugs, lies, and emotional coldness. Pattie said George's cocaine use froze his emotions and hardened his heart. In 1977, their divorce was finalized, and just 2 years later, Pattie married George's close friend, Eric Clapton. Yes, the same Eric Clapton who wrote Layla about Pattie. Meanwhile, George moved on, too. In 1978, he married Olivia Arias, a former marketing executive from A&M Records. They stayed together until the end. But George's passions weren't limited to love and music. There was one more thing he loved, maybe too much: cars. George's obsession with fast cars started when he was just 12, watching the 1955 British Grand Prix. It never stopped. He collected race photos, followed Formula One religiously, and spent hours admiring the engineering behind machines. For George, cars were an escape, a roar louder than fame. George Harrison's final years were quiet, but his legacy, louder than ever. His marriage to Olivia Arias, it lasted until the very end. She wasn't just his wife. She was protector, his anchor, and his voice after death. When George passed, Olivia didn't fade into the background. She fought to keep his name and his music alive, and the world didn't forget. In 2004, George Harrison was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. Yes, not as a Beatle, but as himself. Jeff Lynne and Tom Petty, his bandmates from the Traveling Wilburys, helped give him that honor. It was a moment that proved George wasn't just the quiet Beatle. He was a legend in his own right. Then came 2006. He was added to the Madison Square Garden Walk of Fame for something more than just music. In 1971, George had pulled off something no one had done before: the concert for Bangladesh, one of the first rock benefit shows in history. He didn't just sing for the world. He tried to save it. By 2009, the tributes were still pouring in. He got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, right in front of the Capitol Records building. Paul McCartney was there. So were Jeff Lynne, Tom Petty, and Olivia. But the moment that left everyone speechless? Donnie Harrison, George's son, stood there and chanted the Hare Krishna mantra. It was spiritual, emotional, and so very George. Then in 2011, the world got something deeper. Martin Scorsese released a powerful documentary, George Harrison, Living in the Material World. It peeled back the curtain on George's life, faith, music, and soul. Paul, Ringo, Clapton, Petty, Olivia, Donnie, they all spoke. And what they revealed shocked even longtime fans. By 2015, the Grammys gave George a Lifetime Achievement Award. He was no longer just a band member. He was a timeless voice. Markers, murals, and statues followed. In Benton, Illinois, a plaque stands to remember his first trip to America. And in Liverpool, his childhood home got a blue plaque in May 2024. But behind all the peace signs and flowers, there was a darker story, one the world rarely talks about. The one man George Harrison truly hated. Most fans know about Paul and John's rocky friendship, but the real tension? It was between George Harrison and John Lennon. They met as teens. They started as friends. But fame changed everything. George once worshipped John's brilliance. But over time, he saw another side. Dismissive, cold, controlling. While Lennon wrote anthem after anthem, George's songs got pushed aside, ignored, mocked. Even when George poured his soul into Indian music and spiritual discovery, John laughed at him, and George, he never forgot. Their final conversations were awkward, distant. George admitted it. John could be selfish, difficult, unkind. In George's own book, mine, he barely even mentioned Lennon. That silence, it screamed louder than any argument. And when John was killed, yes, George mourned him, but he never pretended they had made peace. Behind George's soft voice and gentle smile was a man who held on to pain, especially when it came to John Lennon. So what about Paul? Was their feud ever truly resolved? Or did old wounds linger beneath the surface? Let us know in the comments below. And if you loved this deep dive into George Harrison's life, smash that thumbs up button. Subscribe for more untold stories. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a video. See you in the next one.